If you don't know me, my name is Anna Russell. I graduated from Beeson, and I serve here as the events coordinator and the director for the Center for Women in Ministry. So thrilled to be able to have events like this one where we can bring women in ministry in different ways that ministry looks, different walks of life, to come and share what that has looked like for them, what the Lord is doing in their life, and help us all grow together as believers and as women seeking to do the work that God has called us to do. So thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to hand the floor over to Hayden in just a second, give her time to share what she's prepared for us, and then at the end, we will try to have some time for Q&A, where we'll pass this mic around to you guys and let y'all ask your questions for Hayden and interact with her a little bit. But for those of you who don't know Hayden, she also graduated from Beeson with her MDiv in 2013 and lived in Birmingham working at Mountain Brook Baptist for many years after that before moving back to Arkansas, where she and I are both from. We actually are from the same state, went to the same college and the same seminary, but never met until a few years ago. So thrilled that she is here, and so glad that she is going to share a little bit of her story and her wisdom with us. So with that, would you please join me in welcoming Hayden Walker?
Well, friends, it's so good to be with y'all tonight. The topic that we have before us is not one, when I was a student in seminary, this is not one that I would have pegged myself to be the one talking about, because I did not know what story God had laid before me. But part of the grace of God is that we don't know our own stories, right? Because if we did, in some capacity, we might not want to live them. We might not want to walk through what God would set before us. But the thing about grace is that it comes when we need it in those moments. It doesn't come early. It comes right on time. And so God gives us the grace that will be sufficient for us in those seasons, and not in advance of them. Tonight, our topic is what it means to minister to grief and through grief. These are, kind of two sides of the same coin, but they are a little bit different in the respect that you are not always grieving when you're ministering to others. And you're not always grieving when you're meeting others in their grief. So I want to start this evening with looking at the question of how we can minister to others in their grief. How do we meet them there? And the place I want for us to go is to John 11, to see the way that Jesus met people in their grief, how he met Mary and Martha in their grief. Let me just pray for us. Lord, as we spend these moments together, would you, by the power of your Spirit, speak to us? Would you illuminate your word? And God, would you use my feeble words to encourage and build up and edify these sisters for the service of the kingdom and for your glory. In Christ's name, amen. So Jesus finds out the news that his best pal Lazarus has died. And what does Jesus do? Well, he waits a couple of days. But in chapter 11, verse 17, it says, "Now when Jesus came," the way that Jesus first ministers to people in their grief is that he comes to them. I think that this is something that we all can implement in our own life and ministry, is to come to people, to meet them where they are in their grief. The ministry of presence. This is not necessarily even speaking in those early, fresh moments. It is being with people in their pain. And as a minister, you will have the opportunity to enter into those sacred spaces before other people can and will enter in. You will have the opportunity to kind of be a first line of the presence of Christ in somebody's life. This is a holy privilege. In some instances, If there's a tragedy or somebody's sick and in the hospital, you may be there before the family is. You have the opportunity and the calling to live this out, to be one who comes to meet people in their grief. This is exhibiting the ministry of presence. And it wasn't just Jesus that did this, but if you look down at verse 19, it says, many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother as well. So this was a cultural thing that happened as well. And they had this idea of sitting Shiva with one another, of just coming and being and mourning and grieving together, not coming as Job's friends with platitudes and pointing fingers and trying to solve problems and figuring things out. This is coming and being with people. I think that grief can be isolating in a couple of ways. One of those is that for the griever, you feel like everybody else who hasn't experienced this particular type of grief is on this side of the wall, and you are over here alone. So grief has that automatically isolating effect upon you. And then there's a second factor to it of people are scared of grief. People are scared of people in pain. And so people avoid grievers. And so there's kind of this double isolation factor that happens to those in grief. And so when you are willing to be Jesus to the grieving, to the hurting, and enter into those hard places, not having all the answers, because guess what? You're not going to. Not even, living in fear of saying the wrong thing, because guess what? You're probably going to. But being willing to enter those spaces with humility and with dependence upon the Spirit, and with embodying this ministry presence, making yourself known and available to the grieving. The second thing that I think that we see from John 11 is in verse 21. Look at what Martha says to the Lord. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Jesus receives the hard words from the hurting. And I think that it is our own self-protective tendency as ministers, perhaps, as people, as humans in general, that when we receive kind of words of rejection, we kind of want to throw our hands up and scoot on out of the picture. But Jesus receives these hard words, and he's not afraid of what Martha has to say. He can receive the hard words from Martha because he knows that she's speaking from her pain. Jesus knows what he's about to do here for Lazarus, but he receives Martha's pain in an authentic way. Grief will make you say things and do things that are not personal. But people, when you are wounded, it's like a wounded animal. My mom and dad have a beloved cat that has lived in their house with them for 10 years. And Maddox got out one night and something attacked him. And he has lived through the ordeal, but he's had a personality shift. And he won't sit with my mom at night anymore. He's very skittish. And my mom, at first was taking it really personally. It's like, why is this cat that I've sat in my lap, for 3,000 nights in a row, now he doesn't trust me anymore? It's the same kind of thing that when people experience pain, we're kind of like the injured cat, and we're just fearful of anything. We say harsh words and do things that are hurtful, but it's not personal to you as a minister, friends. You keep showing up. You keep bearing the hard words for the people who are in pain. I remember it was about 7 years ago, there was a little girl who died at the church where one of my good friends was serving. And the parents sent out a blog update about this little girl after she died. And they said, we may not be very likable in our grief, but it is only because we liked her so very much. And that left a big impact on me because it's, some of the things that people will do and say in their grief can feel very personal, very painful, that they're reacting out of their pain and truly not, most of the time, wanting to exclude you and push you away. So when you continue that ministry presence and allow them to say the hard things to you, you're exhibiting the presence of Christ in those spaces. And the Lord, he does speak hope. He says, your brother will rise again. Mary says, I know he's going to rise again at the last day. She's basically like, but that doesn't help us today, Jesus. I know he's coming back. I know we have that eschatological hope that's coming for us, but we need some hope right now. And Jesus, of course, does what none of us can do. Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, but he also is pointing her to truth. He's reminding her of what is true. And I think that is another way that we embody the presence of Christ to the grieving. It's not that we push it upon them, but that we gently point others back to the truth of the gospel, to the hope that we have in Jesus. And then, fourth, what does Jesus do? He goes out to her and he wept. Jesus wept. Verse 35. The Jews said, see how he loved him. This is empathy in such a deep place. And Jesus is grieving over the presence of sin as well, but he's grieving over the grief that death has brought into these people whom he loves, into their lives. There's this empathy and this compassion that is raw and real and not manufactured. And that, friends, is another way that we minister to others in the midst of grief, is that we feel, it says Jesus was deeply moved in his spirit, and he wept. We empathize with others in their pain. I would say that another way that we help people in the midst of their grief is to actually help them face their grief. Everybody's going to grieve in a different way. That's part of what the grief journey looks like. C.S. Lewis says in A Grief Observed that even in his own grief journey, he would enter places that looked familiar, except they were entirely new. The terrain kind of looked like a place that he had been before in his grief, but he was spiraling upward and outward in different ways. And so grief for one person can look a lot different. So grief for other people is going to look different for every person. But the one maybe wrong way to grieve, if you will, is to not grieve at all, is to avoid your grief. And so as ministers, I do think that we have a responsibility to help usher people in to grieving well, however that looks for them. However grieving needs to look for them, but to allow people spaces to set aside and process and grieve. It's important, it's vital. And then y'all, this is a real practical one. But I would say, and grief can look a lot of different ways. Somebody could have a painful diagnosis. Somebody could be in a mess of their own making. Somebody could be suffering job loss, financial loss, natural disaster. There's all types of grief. But if you're ministering to somebody who has lost a loved one, which is a very common type of grief, I would encourage two things, friends. Remember their name. Remember the name of their loved one and use it. And number two, if you can, especially if you're a staff minister, I would write this on your work calendar. You write down the anniversary of that person's death, because the griever is always going to be thinking of their loved one. So people will say, well, I don't want to bring it up. I don't want to remind them. You're not reminding them of anything. They're already thinking about their loved one. So when you say their name, you're bestowing dignity upon their grief. And you're reminding them that you're not alone. I'm with you in it. I remember. I haven't forgotten. And it allows them to be seen. And in that way, you're embodying Christ, of seeing people and meeting them where they are. So that's where I kind of want to start us on what it means to minister to grief. Now, the question of how do you minister through grief I think is a little more personal, a little more nuanced, a little more complicated, but it is a part of my story. Some of you, I don't know how many of you perhaps know, if you were in chapel today, you heard at least a glimpse of it, but 7 years ago, I was a full-time staff minister at Mount Brook Baptist Church doing student ministry and loving serving with the students there. And I was pregnant. Actually, it was my second pregnancy. Lost my first baby to miscarriage, which was a unique grief all of its own of, I talked about that wall of isolation that you feel. And miscarriage is not really talked about, especially in the church. So walking with this limp already in my life, become pregnant in the fall of 2015 with a little girl. And we found out at 5 months gestation that she was sick and that she was going to die. And so I had 3 months of carrying Zoe and still working in the church as a staff minister, going through phenomenal, incalculable grief of my own, and still having to and wanting to meet people where they were and their own stories and their own pain. If any of you serve in student ministry or children's ministry or any kind of next-gen ministry, you know that it's not just to the students, but you minister to the families. And so there's this broad spectrum of you are ministering to parents who are dealing with teenagers, and you're working through teenage issues and kids in college, and there's just a wide spectrum of issues and pains and problems that you're walking through life with people. And then all of a sudden, there's an elephant that lands upon you. My church was really gracious to me. In the week after Zoe was diagnosed, actually on Monday, Thursday. And so I can remember leaving Brookwood Hospital and calling my pastor and saying, I'm not going to be able to be at the service tonight because we just found out that our child is going to die. And he said, don't come tonight. Of course, don't come on Sunday for Easter. Don't, take a week and kiss your feet under you. And the church came to me like white blood cells to a cut. And just immediately, the next day, we had piles of meals and food and like really practical ways that people were caring for us in our grief. But we knew it was going to be a long haul because she was still alive. We just found out that she was sick and that she was going to die. So when you deal with a terminal diagnosis like that, this was a unique situation because it was a terminal diagnosis inside of my body. But if you're ministering, if you're working somewhere and you're ministering through your own grief, if you have a parent that dies or a spouse that dies, or if you have some kind of a tragedy in your life or in your family, you're going to be working and walking with a limp. Ministering from a place of just, Lord, my cup is so, there is nothing of my strength in the cup. If anything is going to happen, it's going to have to be from you because I have nothing in me. A really beautiful benefit of suffering deeply, serving in the church, was I got to see the church be the church really well. And I got to be the recipient of the ministry to which I had known was, I knew things were important, to care for people, to care for the hurting, care for the grieving, care for those in pain. But to be the recipient of it, it gives you a different perspective. And so anybody who offered me help, anybody who offered to come and do something either personally for me or for the ministry with which I served, I said yes. which deepened my dependence upon the body of Christ. And really what we're supposed to be doing as ministers of the gospel is to equip the saints for the work of ministry, right? So I got to see that in action really well. And I got to see when people would say, where do you need help this week? Can you be at the church at 6:30 to lead junior high Bible study this week? Yes, I can. Great. I got to see people step in and lead in ways that I think were really, they were beneficial to me in my place of pain, but I think they were beneficial to them as well, to have opportunities to serve in the kingdom. So there's this sense that in the acute stage of grief, you have to keep going. You have to put one foot in front of the other. I had, I don't even remember who gave it to me, but soon after Zoe's diagnosis, people just bring stuff to me. And I got a lot of those adult coloring books that were really good and helpful for me to just concentrate on something and see that I could complete a task, I could color a page. And somebody brought me a dot book, a connect the dot book, but for adults. So they were very complicated. It'd be 1,000 dots on a page. And I remember in those early days of my grief, of my only job right now is just to find the next dot. I don't have to do anything else but look for the next number on this page. It was very cathartic for me. And so there is a sense that in those early days of grief, you are just literally looking for the next dot. And so what part of that means practically in the work of ministry is that you need to clear some stuff off of your plate. It means that you don't have to write all of your own curriculum and Bible study lessons. It means that you can rely on some of those beautiful resources that are out there in that season. It means that you can rely on other gifted people in your ministry sphere to come in and serve alongside you. It means that you get to actually allow the church to be the church. If you know that your grief is going to end in such a way that you're going to need to have a leave of absence, I took a full maternity leave after Zoe was born and died. And so I had 3 months of knowing, that she was going to die, to prepare a plan for my maternity leave, to prepare a plan for my absence. And so I wrote out, detailed things, detailed plans. So I felt like that was a way that I was not just tapping out on my ministry, but continuing to minister through my grief, even in my absence, was by preparing the people around me for that. Now I know some grieving situations are a surprise factor, but this is what I would say to that. You can equip people around you at every point in your ministry, such that you recognize, remember Beyonce used to say, you're not irreplaceable. You aren't. And nobody knows what tomorrow holds for you. And so you can have people around you that know what's going on in your ministry, and you can keep notes in such a way and be organized in such a way that I really think is a gift to the people around you in the event that something were to happen to you. I think that's a ministerial gift and a way that you can minister through your grief, even in the present when things are going well. If you are in a leadership role now, or one day you may be in your church, I think a way that you can help the grieving is by cultivating a culture that honors grief in your churches. Cultivating a culture that honors grief in your ministry circles, and even if you're not in vocational ministry in the church, just in your friendships, in your small group of people around you, to honor and hold space for one another in those deeply painful seasons, to help foster and create a culture that people can step away that there's not this over expectation of what they're going to be able to bring to the table during those really tough seasons. How can we help people respond? How can we help people respond to our grief? I think one of the ways is to be clear. If you are a griever, to be clear about what it is that you need. What does this look like? This may look like you know that you've got these tasks coming up over the next week, and that you need somebody to get dinner for the women's Bible study, and somebody to make sure that the curriculum is there, and somebody to send out the weekly newsletter on Thursday morning. You can make a list of these things and send them out to a group of people that have said to you, hey, let me know how I can help. You add those people to a list, and you say, this is my let me know how you can help list. And then you send them in an email, and you say, these are the ways that you can help. Can anybody sign up for these? They reply, I'll take this one, I'll take this one, I'll take this one. And in that way, people want to help you when you're grieving. They really do, but people so often don't know how to help that they just give these vague blanket statements of like, let me know if I can do anything. And most of the time in your grief, you don't really know what you need or know what you want. I remember Kristen showing up on my porch one day with just a bag of groceries. And that is so appreciated, to just meet somebody where you think they may need you to be met, to just show up. But in the event that you do have a list of people on the let me know how I can side of things, actually let them know, especially if you're in vocational ministry, friends, especially if it's an extended season of pain and grief. If you're working in the church and you find out that your dad has cancer and he's going to be having chemo, and you're going to be needing to be out of the church a weekend a month for the foreseeable future until his treatments are finished, okay, you can work up a plan. You can get this list in play and get people ready to step in and serve in those places. The thing about this, I'm glad we're having this conversation, and I hope the Lord will store some of it away from me. I hope none of you are in a season of deep grief and deep pain at this point in your life. But this is a topic that at least I didn't think about until I was drowning in it myself. But I think that part of that is just our cultural moment in time, that we are super surprised by suffering in our own lives. That we're super surprised when bad things happen, and super surprised when we have to step out of our own plans. James says, you're making plans to go to the next town and do such and such. Whoa. Hold up, friends. I think if we make all these plans for other provisions in our ministry, we ought to at least have a plan in our ministry of what would I do if I needed to step out for a season. I think we would be wise to create such a plan in our lives. That's kind of the acute season of grief, the very fresh, the very raw, like you are in the thick of it season. But grief doesn't just go away. I've seen this analogy floating around on the internet that I love. It's that of a buttery roll, just a roll. And all of a sudden, this trauma comes in, slices the roll open, and places this large frozen pat of butter inside the roll. And that's what grief feels like at first. It's like all you can think about is this frozen rock in your heart that is so utterly incapacitating. Over time, does it go away? It doesn't. But what happens is the butter melts a little bit and the dough is kneaded a little bit, and instead of being just a roll with a pat of butter in the middle, it becomes more of a croissant over time. A flaky, buttery croissant that the pain gets incorporated into who you are. It changes you. Deep suffering changes you. You are not the same at the end of it. And it doesn't go away. Your life builds differently around it and through it. It incorporates itself into your being. And so naturally, after you go through deep pain, deep suffering, there's a new opportunity for you to minister in a new way. Paul talks about this in 2 Corinthians. Starting in chapter 1, verse 3, he says, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our affliction, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. For as we share abundantly in Christ's sufferings, so through Christ we share abundantly in comfort too. If we are afflicted, it is for your comfort and salvation. If we're comforted, it's for your comfort, which you experience when you patiently endure the same sufferings that we suffer. Our hope for you is unshaken, for we know that as you share in our sufferings, you will also share in our comfort." Friends, when you go through the furnace of suffering in your own life, you come out different. But you come out with a story of God's provision and comfort in your own life that can be a powerful point of connection for other people who are grieving. Now, grief looks different for everybody. We've talked about that. And a grieving situation can be totally different from one person to the next. The circumstances of grief can be very different. But grief itself is a universal, transformative experience. And so when you have been through it, when you're not a roll anymore, when you've been turned into a croissant, then you can sit down with another croissant and have a communion with them that you wouldn't otherwise be able to. And I'm going to tell you, I never anticipated that this would be my story. I never anticipated that this would be, suffering would be the predominant platform on which I talk about God's goodness. But y'all, the Lord has opened up so many doors for me to connect with other suffering women. Women waiting, struggling with infertility and an empty womb. Women struggling with the pain of miscarriage. Women struggling with deeply painful diagnoses and death. God has brought about profound connection with other women and opportunities for me to meet them there, minister to them in their pain because of my own suffering. Just last week, a hairdresser at the place I get my hair cut in North Little Rock, there was a connection about a woman in town who had just had a baby die. And so I have a friend, a neighbor behind me, and she's had a baby die as well. And so we show up at this woman's house and leave her some notes and a flower on her doorstep and leave our phone numbers. And we're like, we don't know, what's going to become of this. She reaches out to us. And last Thursday, we had coffee with this woman who just 5 weeks ago had her child die. And, it's not a place, it's not a club that you ever want to be a part of. It's not a club I would have chosen. But God has opened up doors for me to sit and share abundantly in Christ's sufferings, but abundantly in the comfort of God, and share that with other people in their pain. You all have a story. There is no Olympics in the stories of suffering. There are no winners to that game. We all have suffering. We all have stories of pain in our lives. And God can use all of it for His glory. He can use all of it to connect you with other people, to be effective ministers of the gospel. And I will say this, when you hear somebody else's story after you've been through deep pain, make sure, and even ask the Lord before you walk into those places, Lord, let my own pain be behind me in these moments. Let me hear theirs. Because I think we have a natural tendency to want to hear our story and somebody else's story. So when you do have the opportunity, not in the acute phase, but down the road to minister to somebody out of your own story of suffering, ask the Lord to put your story behind you in those moments so that you can be fully present for them in their own sufferings. one final practical note that I've written down here is, Jesus had Peter, James, and John, and they were his crew. I mean, he had the 12, he had the 70, but he had Peter, James, and John right up front, right up close with him. And it's okay in your suffering if you need to keep that circle tight. It is okay in your suffering if you are a minister at a church to keep your circle tight. Because you're still a person. You're still vulnerable. And I would encourage you, as you keep that inner ring around you tight, that it's okay to have a bouncer of sorts, somebody that can, in those acute moments of grief, somebody that can answer the door of your house. Because here's the deal, when you are a minister and you have a visible place in ministry, everybody feels like they know you and want to come and serve you and minister to you, which is a gift of grace from the Lord. But also you're a person and you've got limited capacity. And so it's okay if you don't want to answer the door on the day of somebody's funeral to the 20 random church members that wanted to show up and express their condolences. It's okay to have somebody in that tight ring around you to serve as a bouncer, to open the door and say, blessings, thank you so much for coming. We'll let her know, sign the book. Thank you for the flowers. Thank you for the brownies. Blessings. She's not available right now. That is okay to do. You don't have to have a forward-facing ministry to everybody in your congregation in those moments of acute suffering. It's not easy, y'all. And Paul says in chapter 1, verse 8, we don't want you to be unaware. We don't talk about this. We don't talk about suffering. We don't talk about ministering through grief because it's like the most exciting topic to talk about, but because it's a reality. And because we don't want you to be unaware. For when that time comes in your life, or when that time comes for a fellow church staff member around you, when that time comes just for a parishioner that you know and love. This is a reality of what it is to be human. Grief is part of our go here in this broken world. But we can be the presence of Christ, and we can still effectively, by the grace of God alone, continue to minister through our grief in a way that honors us as broken, frail people, but still gives glory to God in the midst of the congregation. Okay, I think we have some time for some questions.
Thank you, Hayden. One question that came to my mind is I wanted to ask you different ways that you have thought of or practiced where we can cultivate a culture that honors grief in the different places we find ourselves.
Great question. Ways that we can cultivate a culture that honors grief. I think number one is that we actually talk about it, that we actually have openness about our grief. And I think that, if you are in a ministerial role, it has to start with you being willing to be vulnerable. Connection happens through vulnerability. And if you are in a ministry leadership position, your willingness to be vulnerable about the afflictions in your own life begins to cultivate a culture. It's like if you lead a small group Bible study. I'm sure everyone in this room has done this, and you're seated around a table with 6 or 8 women, and everyone at first is giving the really good Jesus answers, and then one person is willing to take it a little bit deeper. And then all of a sudden, it's like the key unlocks, and everybody breathes this deep sigh of relief, and everybody feels the freedom to be vulnerable now. So I think that as ministers, we have an opportunity to kind of set the tone that, we can talk about hard things. I can remember at Mount Brook Baptist, And I shared this at lunch, but I often talked about my suffering as like I suffered in a fishbowl. Like everybody could see it around me. And I felt like I'm going to lean into that. You know, we are in kind of the South where everybody is like this nice culture. How are you doing? Doing great. Like somebody's just got diagnosed with breast cancer and you're like, oh, I'm doing good. Yes. No, I felt like I'm going to be just really honest about it. So when people would say, how are you doing? I'm at the coffee pot on Sunday morning. I was like, I am doing really bad today. I'm having an awful morning. And still, what did I do, Grayson? I would get up. I would read the word. I'd lead the congregation to recite the Apostles' Creed. And I hope, Lord willing, by the grace of God, they got to see you don't have to have it all together to come here and worship. You don't have to have it all together to pray. You don't have to have it all together to even lead worship. And so I think in so doing, people begin, hopefully, to have the freedom to say, I'm not okay. I'm having a really tough time, and yet I'm still plodding through it. So I think as church people, that's an opportunity for us to be vulnerable and to lead. And then if you're in a leadership place, to even lead in such a way that there's policies around, if somebody has a tragedy or somebody's, has a family member in the hospital or whatever, gracious policies that allow time off and space for people to go and do what they need to do in those seasons of suffering.
Hey, I'm Reagan. This is not as eloquently or well thought through question, but we'd love to just hear, you talk about the acute seasons of grief and then what it looks like to step in. But obviously it wasn't this like black and white, like flip of the switch. Okay, now I'm ready to step in to these conversations with women who are struggling with really similar things or really heavy things. What did it look like for you to navigate that gray area of like, okay, I'm not in this acute season of grief, but this is still really, really hard. And you mentioned that prayer at the end of like, okay, Lord, let me not hear their stories. But what did it look like for you to get to a place where you're able to even like stand up and say that or stand up and sit with women in very similar seasons of grieving?
Great question, Reagan. I think for me, and this is a very personal answer, is that when you're in a phenomenal amount of grief, trauma, pain, I can remember looking out my window, Regal Avenue in Crestline Park, and like being like literally confused. How did the sun come up today? Like, why are people driving their cars? The world has stopped for me. Why are people at Publix today? And even people in your immediate circle that love you and feel deeply for your pain, their worlds go on. And so there is this respect that even, as you have to re-enter your new normal of life, you're kind of just going through the motions, and people around you have these expectations of you, like, being okay. Well, you're never going to be okay after a life-altering event. You're going to grow through it. You're going to walk through the valley of the shadow of death, but you're never going to be the person that you were before that phenomenal trauma. And so I think for me, it was a limping into community of women that were in similar places. So when I went back to work at Mount Vernon Baptist after my maternity leave, I just thought, oh my gosh, how am I planning the bus and barbecue event and getting the full moon truck out here and, getting the band ready for this event when like I can barely make myself breakfast this morning, And so I reached out to a friend who I knew had twin girls die, actually. And I reached out to her and said, I need some help. Oh, friends, I forgot to even talk about this. You need a counselor. You all need a counselor. So I reached out to this friend. She is an LPC. And I said, I have got to have somebody to help me. I feel so isolated, so alone, so behind that wall. I don't know anybody else who has walked through a similar journey. I've got to have somebody behind the wall with me. And she said, let me have you over for breakfast next week. And so that was the beginning of this little community of women here in Birmingham that we met every 2 weeks for a couple of years until we moved off to different places. But that community, that breakfast club is what we called ourselves, was what enabled me, I think, to see other people's stories and sit in other people's pain in a really beautiful and helpful way that has enabled me now to hopefully be a safe place for women who are in that acute season of suffering. But we were all in the thick of it together. We were like, there was no warrior among us. We were all just a bloody mess together. But the Lord used that.
I just want to ask, I feel like a woman in our natural status, we have a tendency to jump into the deep water by giving ourselves in their grief. And that would very often make women themselves like vulnerable, like or kind of hard to differentiate whether I'm depending on myself for others' grief or I'm depending on Jesus for others' grief. And because I see some women who have very great heart for the Lord, they are helping others who are in their dark season, but they end up involve themselves into that dark, deep toxicity, and they just cannot get out on their own. So I just want to hear how you, in your ministry, when you come into the grief of others, because it's not like, in reality, it's not the pain itself. There's a toxicity, pain, a lot of mess altogether in others' life. And when you pain in others' pains, how you balance this, I'm depending on Jesus and not getting her or his darkness to myself too much, to what extent I do this in Jesus' strength, not my own strength, how to balance that.
Yeah, that's a great question, which I think is the danger of enmeshment in ministry, of, to a certain degree, you want to bear one another's burdens as your own, yes, but you cannot allow yourself to, you still have to stand on the firm and solid rock that is beneath you. You can't jump off into the pit with somebody. You can't help somebody up out of a pit if you've jumped totally in it with them. You can lay on the solid ground and you can hold their hand down in the pit, but if you fall into the pit too, you're no help to anybody, much less to the one down there in the pit with you. And so I think that we have to keep our feet on the solid ground. We have to keep our feet rooted in the reality of the gospel, yes, and rooted in the reality of the hope that is to come. I think that part of the spiral of grief that's so disorienting is that you literally lose your orientation of what is right and good and true and eternal perspective. You lose a lot of that in the tornado, the acute, immediate tornado of grief. And so I think to have somebody who is firm and steady, that is able to speak truth into you, it's like what Jesus says to Martha. She hits him with these hard words and he responds with compassion. He lets her say the hard things, but he responds with compassion and with truth. And I think that we as ministers meet people in their pain, and we go to the pain, but we don't jump in the pits so far with them that we become enmeshed in their own pain. It's not healthy, and not only in grief, but just in people's own lives and stories. As a minister, that type of enmeshment it'll wreck you pretty quick in ministry.
Thank you, Hayden, for all you shared. What I feel like I've heard you say both tonight and in your sermon earlier today is the way that God has brought purpose out of your pain. But I also feel a tension with, especially maybe in trying to comfort someone else in their pain, how telling someone else that God has a purpose for their pain can be weaponized, or just bring the message that they need to make their pain count, or I just think it can really diminish maybe someone's pain to suggest that they need to find that purpose or work towards it. So I guess, is that a tension that you've recognized in your own ministry, of being able to see the way God has brought purpose in your own story, but walking with people who aren't to that other side yet?
That is a phenomenal question, Emily. I think that we want to put grief on a timeline, and we want grief to fit nicely into our own little expectations of what it should be. And so I think that far too often when that is weaponized, it's because it's used way too early. I'm talking about a year or two into it, like maybe 3 years into it. There may be a long season, years that pass before you can see what God was doing in your pain. You may never really fully see it in this life. That doesn't mean that God's not doing something, but you just may never see it fully realized. I think it is so painful when you meet somebody in an acute phase of grief, which I would say the acute phase of grief for me, everybody grieves differently, it was at least a year of just like trying to get through. And so I think a lot of times when that feels so painful for people, it is because their wound is so fresh still. And it has to be a personal thing that God is revealing to them, that God is showing them that purpose out of their pain, and not necessarily somebody pointing it out to them. So as a minister, I think your responsibility is to be there, to give your presence, to weep with them, to listen, really be a good listener. And when they need that reminder of truth, not that you're drawing out significance out of their pain, but when they need a reminder of the truth of the hope of the gospel, you can serve as that reminder. But you're not giving them platitudes for their grief. It is not helpful. It is not helpful. And here's the deal, and I think I touched on this briefly in the first segment, but when you're ministering to somebody who's grieving, you're going to say the wrong thing. Because everybody in that fresh season of grief, there are trigger points all around the box, friend. You're not going to be in the box for long without hitting one of them. But if you have made your love known to that person through your consistent ministerial presence to them, they'll have a little grace for you when you hit those triggers. But don't let your fear of saying the wrong thing prevent you from being present with somebody.
Thank you again, Hayden, just for being so generous with your story. This is really just for my own personal edification, and I'm sure you could talk about this for a whole nother hour, but I really loved what you said about how suffering refines and sanctifies. And I'm just curious if you can narrow it down to one or two. Has there been something about the Lord's character or his truth that has just like completely been transformed through your suffering? What have you learned more about him? And again, I know that's such an open-ended question, but I'd love to hear some of your kind of top hitters.
Question. Yeah. My passage that I leaned upon when Zoe was sick was Isaiah 43. And I love these words, and I memorized these words, and these were the words that I was reciting out loud. She was being born. The Lord says, "Fear not, for I've redeemed you. I've called you by name, and you are mine." When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you. When you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned, and the flames shall not consume you. He doesn't say if you pass through the waters. He says when you pass through the waters, because we're all going to pass through them. But when you go through them, God is going to be with you. And I knew it, Rebecca. I knew the truth in my mind, but I got to live it. And you know Philippians 4, the peace that passes all understanding. But I lived it. I literally, in those days after Zoe died, there was peace that passed. It did not make sense, the peace that filled that hospital room at Brookwood Hospital. I know Jesus more intimately, but I also know the power of the cross in my life. I look to the cross of Jesus, and I know that he is for me, that he has not abandoned me, and that even in the place of my deepest pain and suffering, that God is for me, and not only that, but God is with me. And he doesn't abandon me in my suffering, but he goes with me through it. There are many, many more things that I could say about what I learned about the Lord through her sickness and life and death, but just his nearness and his unbelievable presence and strength that he grants you in that moment. It staggered me. And I read that text 1,000 times. Peace that passes understanding. You're like, that is so sweet. I love that. But it is a different thing to embody a peace that didn't even make sense to me, much less to the people around me. That was an emotive answer a little bit, but did that answer everything that you wanted there? Yeah. Let me say this too, just when I turn to Isaiah 43, it makes me think, I talked a little bit this morning about establishing, you can't prepare for pain, you can't prevent pain to come into your life, but you can cultivate routines of receiving that day-by-day renewal of communion with Christ in his word. And so y'all, the morning after Good Friday, when I woke up, and, go into the Word. It's not like, okay, you don't have to sit here and say, like, what am I going to read today? Like, where are we going to go? Had my reading plan. I was in the Minor Prophets during that season. It's like, okay, here we go. And you read the next chapter. That was a really holy liturgical practice for me, was just to read the next chapter. That's kind of what I was talking about having plans in place, even in your ministry life, of having clear plans and programs for what you're doing and why and how, so that when something unthinkable happens, that's already in place. It's the same kind of thing in your own spiritual life and development. You have a plan in place, a consistent plan of spiritual formation working in you, so that when you get to those moments that you can't you can't find the next dot on the page, you can't draw something fabulous out of your own imagination, you just look for the next dot. You read the next chapter and receive manna out of that word.
I have a question. So on the practical side of things, as we are ministering to people who are walking through grief, what are practical ways that, like, as our normal life kind of trudges on and that person is still in the very fresh stages of grief, how can we, as those who are ministering to them, be intentional about asking how they are, but also maybe the response is, I'm doing okay. What can we do practically to kind of come alongside and show care, whether it's something as simple as bringing the brownies or the flowers, or just perhaps asking a different question of then how are you doing? Because I feel like when you're walking through grief, that's the last question you want to be asked. And so what is a way to still care for that person well in an intentional way that's not asking that same question over and over again?
Yes, that you're right. I think it is asking the wrong question. I think there are very practical ways of meeting somebody's, needs. After I had a C-section, I couldn't drive. Meredith drove me around places that I needed to be. Like, there are some very practical ways that you can serve people that I think we perhaps would all think. One of my favorite things to do, file this away, friends. When somebody's grieving, I loved, because somebody did this for us, I love to take in paper products, paper plates, disposable cups and forks and knives and stuff, because everybody brings you this food, but you don't want to do the dishes. And disposable paper goods are such a practical gift in ministry that you can give to somebody who's grieving, that you can drop on their doorstep with a note or something like that. Callie, I would also say, as you mentioned, as kind of the world goes on, I would encourage you, if it's somebody close in your ministry circle in life, somebody in your ministry sphere that you're serving, that you mark those dates, like a 3-month, 6-month, 9-month, 12-month on the calendar, and reach out to them. And not necessarily in a question format, like, hey, I know this is the 3-month anniversary of your mom dying, and just wanted to see how you are. Not even like that, but just like, I know what today is. Like, just the acknowledgement that they're not alone in remembering the weight of whatever day that is. And then I think, too, trying to avoid that question, how are you, as much as possible, because I know in my own grief, that's a very nebulous question.
Yeah.
Like, how am I doing physically? I can stand up and walk today, so that's progress. It's like there are different layers. How my heart is bursting open onto the floor. I can't make any food to feed me and Cody. So that question is too broad, too big, too nebulous. You can ask somebody, have you read something today that has encouraged you? Has something reminded you of your loved one lately? If somebody's walking through illness or sickness or incarceration of a loved one, something like that, you can ask, have you talked to so-and-so today? Giving them questions that they can answer briefly if they want to, but that can also be more open-ended into cultivating the conversation with them. That's not just, how are you doing? Good. That's the kind of question that I try to not ask my kindergartner when he comes home from school. How was your day? Because I'm going to get one word versus asking more pointed questions. Now, I think part of knowing what questions specifically to ask, Callie, is knowing the person.
Yeah.
And part of that, if you're serving in the church, not even vocationally, if you're serving in the church just as an invested ministry leader, part of what it is to be a good shepherd under the good shepherd is to smell like your sheep, right? That you're spending enough time with your sheep that you know what matters to them, what's important to them. You're smelling like your sheep, so that when one of your sheep does go through a season of suffering, you know pretty specifically what kinds of questions, what kind of conversations may be most valuable to them, what spaces they may be willing to go with you. And I'll say this too. Sometimes people want to be talked to about anything other than their grief.
Yeah.
So maybe the question is not, how are you? But maybe the question is, I had a chai tea this morning, and I know how much you love those and thought of you. Just even something that doesn't require a response. Just to continue the conversation. Because remember, we talked about that wall of isolation that keeps people away, and they feel isolated. And sometimes when you don't respond to somebody, and you don't respond to texts or calls, or you don't want to answer the door, whatever, people stop calling, people stop texting, people stop showing up. But it's not really because they want to push you away. It's just because they have such a limited capacity to engage with somebody else. But don't quit reaching out. And so some of those attempts at reaching out that aren't even a question, or just a statement of I'm thinking about you and remembering you, I think can be really helpful to the griever.
So one of the super early things you said was you have to grieve, and you can't just ignore it. I feel like I've been blessed in my life so far that I really haven't had to grieve much. And as a result, there is a drive for me to want to know how to help others in their grieving, because I wouldn't know how to react because I haven't had to do it but maybe one time. But my question is, how do you kind of like gauge if you've grieved enough and to not ignore it and put it off, but also not let it consume you in a negative way? Like, where's that balance of, hey, like I am grieving, I am getting this out, I am processing these things in a way that you can kind of like know that you're doing those things?
That's a great question, and very subjective from person to person, isn't it? I think something that's healthy to do in grief is to know and to give people the freedom to create spaces to grieve, that you don't have to grieve every second of every day. Because it is this weird balance of after that very acute phase of like there is joy mixed in. I'm talking about the croissant. You know, there are going to be some chocolate chips mixed in there too. Like they're going to be good parts and hard parts, and it's all going to be mixed up together. But you don't have to just grieve all day long every day. I think it's okay to set some time and to say, you know, I'm still walking through the journey of grief, but when I go to get the boxes out and look through Zoe's clothes and blankets and stuff, I'll know, like, I'm going to do this for an hour. I'm going to do this for 90 minutes. And then I'm going to write her a letter in my journal, close it up, and I'm going to go about the rest of my day. So I think for me, it has been helpful to set aside, to like know that I'm going to set aside times and spaces to grieve. And it almost takes the cloud off so that I can say, okay, I'm not, and Lacey, I'm 7 years into this journey. You know what I'm saying? This is not in the early seasons when it is all consuming. But you can say, whew, her birthday's coming up. This is going to be super hard. But I know that I'm going to have a period of time on that day to feel all the feelings, to look at all the stuff, to look at all our pictures, to, you know, all of these things. And we're somatic creatures, aren't we? And so there are some ways that we can help people to lean into grief, I think, too, that are even bodily, of helping people to go places that they may be avoiding, because the body stores all that up, you know, and to go to a place where something hard happened, maybe you go with them, you know, whatever it is, but to encourage people to eat that meal again, smell that smell, burn that candle, listen to that song again, whatever it is, to help people enter those spaces and grieve and feel the emotions and remind themselves of what's true. Because it's ultimately it's like the dead cat thing, you know, the proverbial dead cat that you put in the box and, you know, set aside. It's a dead cat. It's going to smell bad. But if you take the lid off the box and you let it air out and you know, can decompose and things can happen, like it's still going to stink, but it's going to do its work, rather than you putting the lid on the box, put it in the corner, and then it's going to stink up. It's still going to stink, but it's going to stink up your life in all these sideways ways. It's a very hard and very individual question for the type of grief that it is and for the griever themselves and their own personality and proclivities.